Welcome, welcome everyone to another Living Life Naturally podcast. Today I have with me Emily Givler, and she is a functional genetic nutrition consultant and dietary supplements counselor. Long title, with a NutriGenetic Research Institute and Tree of Life. So she specializes in food sensitivities, utilizing genetically influenced dietary protocols. And these are designed to maximize health outcomes while maintaining a healthy relationship with foods. And she holds degrees from the Holt Institute of Medicine and Pan American Institute. She makes complicated genetics and biology understandable. Appreciate that. And if you choose, she can nerd out on multiple health topics. So Emily feels this is a really exciting time to work in health and wellness. Traditional medicine, acute care medicine, medicine 101 has really not done a good job of addressing chronic health conditions, which we'd all agree with. But we're coming to a new understanding of chronic health conditions. So Medicine 2.0 brings a deeper understanding of our physiology, our biochemistry, and our own unique bioindividuality, which is shaped not just by our genetics, but by our microbiome, our environmental exposures, our traumas, and our infectious exposures. So Emily believes that as we integrate all of these pieces, we find new, unique, and better ways of helping people who are suffering from chronic health conditions. So welcome to the podcast, Emily. Thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It is really my pleasure to be here.
And where are you joining us from today?
I am in Pennsylvania in the United States.
Okay. How's your weather up there?
It's a little rainy today, but this is a lovely time of year.
Yes, I love the fall. Wish we had one in Florida, but we don't. So first of all, I'd love to get your take on why you got into this type of thing, plus why Medicine 2.0 is different from what we have previously known.
Sure. Like so many people in my field, my own health challenges really led me into this work. I developed chronic pain and chronic fatigue when I was about 14 years old, and I was shuffled from doctor to doctor for about 5 years looking for an explanation or a diagnosis, and nothing really helped. And nothing got me any closer to an answer, let alone to feeling better. So after 5 years, I finally showed up in front of a rheumatologist who diagnosed me with fibromyalgia. And because of the severity and duration and how young I was at the time, I was told to anticipate being disabled by the time I was 30. And that struck me as a really poor plan.
Yes.
And so I was prescribed a lot of painkillers, which fortunately I was able to avoid and just kind of push through the pain. But I was given a label, but no answer or explanation. And that felt really hopeless. So I had to try to figure things out for myself. And that really set me on the path at looking at nutrition, and then functional genomics really held a lot of additional answers for me. So I'm happy to say that I will be 40 next month, and I am not disabled. I am not still living with the same type of chronic pain or fatigue that I had 20 plus years ago. And I've been able to find a course that worked for me and use my own experience to really help other people find a path that works for them. And that's where Medicine 2.0 really comes in. When we are not dealing with just an acute pathogen or a broken bone, something like that. There we absolutely need that traditional model of Western medicine. It does a lot of good, but for people who are living with things like autoimmune conditions or other types of chronic pathologies, the acute care model gives us a Band-Aid, but it doesn't go upstream and explain what's actually going on in our physiology and causing these altered, uncomfortable symptoms that may not kill us, but certainly impact our quality of life.
Right.
So we can use medicine 2.0 to go upstream and find that root cause and deal with that so that we can change our health outcomes and our quality of life long term.
And what are some of the ways that we can follow that path to actually find what the root cause is?
So it almost always involves working with a knowledgeable practitioner, someone like a functional medicine doctor or a nutritionist or naturopath who is going to help you run the right tests. So my particular area of expertise is functional genomics, and the genetics gives us a functional framework or the context that we're working in. It shows us the areas that our body handles things really well and maybe not so well, so that we can refine and really hone in. But genetics is predictive, it's not a guarantee. So we also need to run additional functional lab tests to kind of contextualize things or add depth and understanding to the picture of what's actually presenting versus what's just ancillary and kind of there in the background, not creating any issues. So there's a lot of layers that can go into it. As a nutritionist, I don't diagnose or treat, but I help people find things that may work better for them, things that may not work quite as well. For people with food sensitivities in particular, sometimes there are broad classes of foods that can be identified within the genetics, things like impaired histamine clearance or gluten sensitivity, dairy intolerance, things like that. And so having that genetic framework can help us make informed choices specific to us.
So the tests themselves show the genetic markers.
So the testing that I use is the YGR, or Your Genomic Resource Test Kit. So this is a saliva test or a buccal swab for infants or people who may have something like Sjogren's who can't develop enough saliva to spit. And it analyzes over 200,000 SNPs or genetic markers. And then we upload it into a software program that helps us make sense out of all of that huge amount of data. So when we have this genomic report in front of us, this is where you need a skilled practitioner to help you make sense out of all of it. It can feel really overwhelming. For a lot of practitioners, it can feel overwhelming when you first start looking at these reports to see all of this information. So we always want to contextualize that genetic information from the gene test, whether it's something like 23andMe or YGR. There's a number of different direct-to-consumer tests or clinician-specific tests available on the market these days. And then we want to layer in additional functional lab work or blood work, depending on our personal needs and what we have going on. We might need functional hormone testing. We might need thyroid testing, which would be blood work. We might need something called urine organic acid testing. That's one that I use an awful lot. It gives us really good insight into detox capacity, what's happening metabolically in our bodies with our use of carbohydrates and proteins and fats. It gives us a good picture for what's happening in the microbiome. So layering these tests together, depending on our individual need, we can go test crazy and recommend thousands and thousands of unnecessary tests. But if we hone in on our individual needs, what our symptoms and what our genetics are telling us, we can really start to refine and personalize our protocols and move outside of this cookie cutter approach to medicine or even to nutrition. We know that there's no one size fits all magic bullet approach.
Yes, absolutely. And that's kind of the thing with Western medicine, because it is to them a one size fits all. I found that in my own life. Well, if this is happening, then this is the way that you go. And it can be very frustrating because you don't seem to move forward at all. And I think that what you're doing is really, well, for one thing, it's fascinating, but it definitely gets into what I've always believed is right, the root cause, which the Western medicines really don't do. So where in all of this does it come into play where you deal with molds or detoxification or things like that to help people?
So in terms of root cause, at least with my own particular clientele, which is probably fairly self-selecting, um, mold and mycotoxin toxicity is one of the major hidden root cause triggers for a lot of chronic health conditions. It may not be the only piece, but it's often an underlying piece. So when we're talking about mold, we're talking about two separate things. There's the living mold, those spores that are alive, and then there are the mycotoxins, which are the non-living toxic metabolic byproduct that the living mold produces. And the mycotoxins have really significant and wide-ranging health impacts on people. They trigger things like mast cell activation. They can be endocrine system disrupting, so they mess with our hormones, mess with our thyroids. They impair detoxification. They are nephrotoxic to the kidneys. They're hepatotoxic to the liver. They're immunosuppressive, which in this day and age, more than ever, we really want a robust, functional immune system.
Yes.
So their impacts on the body are really varied. And in a shockingly large percentage of my chronically ill client base, we see mold and mycotoxins as one of those underlying root cause pieces. The organic acids test that I mentioned earlier can give us some good markers if there is colonized mold in the body, specifically the urine organic acid test from Great Plains Lab. Not every organic acid test is created equal. So that one gives us some good colonized mold markers. And there are a number of tests available now to measure mycotoxin excretion. And, as we are working on clearing these chemicals from the body, these mycotoxins, we use a lot of different phase 2 liver detoxification pathways. So this is a really complex biochemical process that's going on in the body. And from a genetic standpoint, there's a lot of places where there can be additional challenges that may cause us to bioaccumulate these toxins at a higher rate. And if we are holding on to those toxins, they're getting stored in the fatty tissue, and they're continuing to exert these toxic effects on the body. Those people who retain them at higher levels are going to be more vulnerable to those compounding effects on the body, whether it's inflammation, brain fog, sleep disruptions, hormonal disruptions, thyroid dysfunction. The list is really wide ranging. And mold is something that doesn't necessarily impact every single person in a household the same way. We could have one person who is completely healthy and then another person who is developing more and more food sensitivities, who has chronic rhinitis, frequent migraines, body aches and pains, brain fog, mood changes, really dramatic symptoms. And you may not automatically think that it's a toxin in the home because not everyone is feeling the same way. So it's something that gets frequently overlooked. And it's easy to think that mold is just a problem if you're not keeping your house clean or if you had a major flood. But often the mold in our homes is hidden places like between walls where we're not necessarily seeing it, leaks kind of behind floors or in between walls where we're not getting that water stains, places like behind bathtubs, behind dishwashers. So we want to be aware of it if we have unexplained symptoms, especially if they started either on the heels of known flooding or moving into a new home. One interesting way that we can use some of these lockdowns to our advantage is, if we started getting worse as we had to stay home more, if we had a couple of symptoms and then once we were locked in our homes, we started getting more frequent headaches, more frequent sinus issues, pulmonary symptoms, more mood changes. there might be a toxin in the home like mold that has been impacting us. Conversely, our offices, our schools, they're not immune to mold either. So we got better when we were no longer in our office or no longer in a school. And then as we went back into it, we started getting sick again. There may be mold in that public space that we're spending a lot of time in. So it can be a little bit challenging to locate the source, but especially with all of the flooding that we're seeing, especially on the eastern and southern parts of the US, it's definitely a growing concern that we may be throwing fuel on these kind of chronic illness fires with the hidden mold.
So you deal obviously with a person's body and how to get detoxification from the inside out, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But do you deal at all with those pathogens or mold and mildew within the home? How does one find out if it's actually in the home?
So I can give broad recommendations, but that's definitely not my area of expertise. But if you think that you have mold in your home, just like with the body, I like to be very logical and step by step. So you can get what are called mold plates, which are little petri dishes with a growth medium, fairly inexpensively online. So if you suspect that maybe there's mold in your home, or if listening to this, you're all of a sudden really concerned that maybe there is, and you're not aware of it, pick up a couple of those plates. Again, they're fairly inexpensive. One company that makes them is Immunolytics, but there are a few different ones available. So you can find them places like Amazon, and you want to put those out. Mold spores are heavy. They're going to settle out in dust. So you want to put them low on the ground, like on your floor. And in this case, if you suspect mold, we want to find it. So shake out your curtains, dust your room while they're out. This is going to be our big indicator. Is there any mold? So leave them out for a few hours, then put the lid on, put like a rubber band around it, put it in a Ziploc bag. If you're going to grow mold, you don't want to contaminate yourself. So seal it up and then put it in a dark place like a cabinet or a drawer for about 5 days, and check it like once a day, see what grows on it. So mold spores growing on that petri dish will be round and fuzzy. Things like yeast will be round, smooth circles, and bacteria tend to be red or orange if they're growing on those plates. So if you're seeing a lot of spores growing, especially if you did not stir up a lot of dust, you may want to take the next step. Some of the mold plates come with a lab analysis where you can send that plate off to the lab and they'll tell you what grew. Or you can just visually eye it up and say, oh, that is a lot of mold, or it's not a lot of mold. But your next step, once you have done that type of testing, would be to either get a mold inspector out to your home to identify the source of the moisture and where the mold is concentrated, as well as typing to determine what species are there and how pathogenic they are, and help you develop a remediation plan. So that's going to look just like how we approach the body is going to look different from person to person. How you approach the home is going to differ depending on whether it's water runoff or a leak within the home. So there's a lot of different variables, but you want an inspector to identify what is there and where it's coming from and how you deal with it. And then you want a completely separate, unaffiliated company to actually do the remediation. So it may seem silly to have two separate people here, but this way you avoid some potential major conflicts of interest. So separate inspector versus remediator to address the home. In the short term, people can make sure they are running dehumidifiers. Keeping the humidity level between 45 and 55% should keep mold growth to a minimum or stop it. So that is a practical tool that we can use. Air purifiers. HEPA units are okay, but the mold spores can still grow on the filter. So there are air purifiers that include things like UV lights that actually kill mold spores. Something like that can help improve that indoor air quality as well. Another way of screening to see whether it's your home that may be contributing to your symptoms, if you are able to take a 2-week break from your home, either going on vacation, going camping, staying with a friend or family member, but physically removing yourself from that space completely for at least 2 weeks. If your symptoms start to settle down and then they come back when you go back to the home, there's probably something like mold in the home exacerbating your symptoms. So we can take these step-by-step methods for screening our homes. And then there are other step-by-step things that we can do to screen our bodies to see whether it is mold, because we could have mold exposure from a decade ago, and those mycotoxins have just been retained in our bodies. It's not necessarily an acute exposure, but we would always want to rule that out.
And so when you're dealing with the body, do you have of course, I don't want you to give away the whole thing, but are there some specific steps that you take? Obviously with nutrition, but are there other things that are involved besides the nutritional part of it?
Oh, absolutely. And I had the good fortune a few years ago to be involved with a significant research project with Drs. Neil Nathan and Dr. Beth O'Hara to do a deep dive research review on all of the published literature on mycotoxin detoxification. So we kind of collated all this data to map out the different liver detox pathways that these different mycotoxins use, because not every mold makes the same mycotoxins. So there's a lot of different types of mycotoxins that our bodies are exposed to. So part of getting better from that involves identifying what you have so that you can best support the appropriate pathway. For many people, we use things like glutathione to help support phase 2 liver detox, but depending on what mycotoxins you have, that may not be the way to get rid of them for you. So part of it is identifying what's there. Using things like binders is a really good and often very safe step for people who are dealing with mycotoxin toxicity. So things like activated charcoal, bentonite clay, zeolites, glucomannan, taken on an empty stomach, away from medications or supplements or food by at least 2 hours, can help to bind to and eliminate mycotoxins from the body. So that is one of our starting points for most people. We also work on supporting the gallbladder and supporting the liver, both through appropriate food and supplementation to help with bile production, toxin excretion. And then as we identify which of these pathways are impacted, we can get progressively more aggressive as the body will tolerate it. Things like sweating is another really excellent way of clearing mycotoxins from the body. So, you know, as long as we're rehydrating after the fact and putting those minerals back in, and as long as we are not sensitive to the heat, sometimes people with mast cell activation syndrome don't do really well with things like sauna. But if that's not the case for you, a sauna is a wonderful way to push a lot of mycotoxins out of the body.
So I would imagine it could be a fairly long process for people.
Like so many things in medicine 2.0, I would say it depends. There are really a lot of variables. So if we have a genetically vulnerable pathway and we have an environmental toxin that needs to be cleared through that vulnerable pathway, that person is going to be more challenged than someone whose enzymatic function is more robust. So the people who come to see me tend to be kind of the canaries in the coal mine. They're genetically vulnerable, so they feel the impacts of those environmental toxins more than someone else might. So we may need to do a little bit more to upregulate that pathway. Now, I love when people are proactive and don't wait until things are really bad to intervene. And if that's the case, and you're saying, you know what, we just had this flood, last week or last month, nobody's really sick, but let's work on supporting ourselves so that we don't get that way. Let's make sure there's no mold in our house. That person is going to clear those mycotoxins more quickly than someone who lets this build up and build up and build up over time. So there are people who, 3 months, 6 months, they feel great. There are other people who it's a couple of years before they really recover the quality of life that they're looking for. There's no one set timeline.
Right.
My crystal ball is only so good, Liz.
So, Emily, tell people where they can find you.
So my clinical practice is at Tree of Life in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. Our website is tolhealth.com. And then I also work mentoring practitioners, helping them figure out how to put all of these pieces together in a meaningful way for their clients and patients. So for any practitioners who are interested in learning more about this approach, they can find me at beyondprotocols.org.
Awesome. And do you have any last minute tips for our listeners today?
So with all of these detox pathways, the more stresses we can take off of the system, the better off we are. So baby steps are better than no steps. Filter your water, filter your air, pull out toxic personal care products from your routine. Even if you're dealing with mold as the underlying trigger, the less toxins you put in from other places, the better you're going to feel.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today. It's been a pleasure. Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.